Well, hello, St. Philip's family. The last 2 Sundays, we've heard excellent sermons from Brian and Jeff on the importance of being ready for when Christ returns. Brian preached on the parable of the 10 virgins 2 weeks ago, and Jeff preached on the parable of the talents this past Sunday. And each of those passages serve as warnings to be alert at all times, to not fall into carelessness, because Christ will return. In our college fellowship on Wednesdays, we've been making our way through the book of Hebrews. And there are numerous warning passages in Hebrews where the author pleads with us, with his audience, to stay the course, to hold fast to their faith, to not drift away. You see, the warning passages in the Bible are admittedly difficult to hear because they're not warm and fuzzy. But that's precisely why the Bible is such a practical book. God doesn't speak to us in an ethereal or wishy-washy sort of way. He speaks to us about the way things really are. God doesn't just tell us what we want to hear, He tells us what we need to hear. And these warning passages are immensely practical, even though they may be hard to hear. But they aren't just difficult because they might be hard to hear, they can also be confusing to understand. So today I want to take a moment and think about how Christians ought to understand the warning passages in the Bible. And to do that, I've made this lovely chart that hopefully you can see there on your screen. I apologize for being such a nerd, but I love charts and diagrams. I find they make things clear, so I hope it's a blessing to you. I find that there are two extreme errors that Christians tend to go to when it comes to making sense of God's warnings. And those two ways are this. The first extreme is to see warnings as something that ought to rob us of any assurance of our salvation. And that's because at the end of the day, it's up to us to save ourselves. Because we can't be sure what we'll do in the future, we therefore can't be sure that we are truly saved. And this extreme believes that you can be saved, but you can also lose that salvation depending on your future faith and actions. Now you can see this extreme that I just said in the far left column in red. And the second extreme is on the other end of the spectrum, and you can see it in blue. And if the first view is that warnings take away any assurance of salvation, because in the end it's up to us, then the second extreme is that we can be so assured of our salvation that the warning passages in the Bible are completely irrelevant to Christians. If God saves me and it has absolutely nothing to do with me, then warnings in the Bible are of no importance to me whatsoever. And what I want to suggest today is that warnings are neither of these errors. Warnings are not irrelevant for Christians, nor ought they rob us of our assurance of salvation. Well, how can this be? Well, let's look a bit deeper. You see, in the first extreme, salvation is all up to me. I am the deciding factor. This view of salvation is attributed to a man named Pelagius who lived around 400 AD. Pelagius emphasized free will so much that he said at the end of the day, it's up to us to save ourselves. God's grace is simply giving us an example to follow. Grace is merely God's instruction on how to live. And this view became known as Pelagianism, and it was St. Augustine who successfully refuted Pelagius. Augustine said Pelagius gave too much credit to natural human ability. He said Pelagius overlooked that we are in fact natural sinners. And Augustine corrected him by asserting that the church has always said that we all inherit a sin nature from our first parents. And because of this, we're not born morally neutral. All of us who are born after Adam are sinners. And if it was up to us to save ourselves and to live a moral life, then no one would succeed. And this view was condemned in the year 416. But there are more nuanced versions of this view today. Did you know that a study done back in the year 2000 showed that about 75% of Americans agreed with this statement, that God saves those who help themselves? That's 3 out of 4 Americans, and I'm only sure that that has gone up today. But that statement is nowhere to be found in the Bible. In fact, it's antithetical to what the Bible teaches. And there's a softer form of this statement that's prevalent in the church today. And it's the view that Though we are born naturally sinners, God gives everyone equally the grace to trust in him for salvation. Sure, we need God's help, and this he gives to everyone, indiscriminately. But at the end of the day, it's up to us to take advantage of what God has offered. God's grace brings us in, but the final verdict is up to us to save ourselves. We can lose the salvation that God has given us. And it's our choice, once again, that is the determining factor for who's in and who's out. So you can imagine how this view understands the warning passages. Warnings are intended to create in us doubt and fear so that we can fearfully try harder and do better. Warnings in the Bible show us that we can have no assurance of our salvation, and therefore we become extremely scrupulous and anxious. This extreme sees God's warnings like this. Imagine a neutral referee shouting out the rules of the game and then passively sitting back to see who's going to win. That's what God's doing in giving warning passages giving warnings according to this view. It's not up to the referee, it's up to the players. And the referee's just there to ensure that everyone plays by the rules. But is this really the picture that God portrays of himself in the Bible? Isn't he much more than just a neutral referee? God seems to intervene in a much more active and decisive way on behalf of his people. Well, that's the first view. What about the second extreme? The opposite view is that God saves us in such a way that the warnings in the Bible are of no significance to Christians. And this view wrongly understands salvation again. It sees salvation as something completely happening outside of us. It has nothing to do with us almost whatsoever. If salvation is all up to God, then couldn't you see how some might think that no matter how we live, God's going to save us? This was what appalled Pelagius, people who claimed to be Christians but whose lives were so hypocritical and irreverent. Today, this is the view of many who say that they're a Christian because they've prayed a prayer or they've walked down an aisle at an altar call years ago, but that being a Christian doesn't really make much difference in their lives today. In short, being a Christian is like having a get-out-of-hell-free card. Can't you see how this view would lead to extreme laxity or licentiousness? If we are saved and our lives now have no correlation to our afterlife, then of course we would be flippant and callous when it comes to God's warnings now. So how should we approach God's warnings? How can we avoid these two extremes? Well, we ought to affirm that salvation is completely a work of God from start to finish. But where the second view goes wrong is that it sees salvation as entirely outside of us, that God saves us independent from anything happening within us. In truth, God saves us by making dead people alive. He doesn't just give us the chance to save ourselves, he really does save us himself. But he does this by effectively renewing our hearts and our wills, and by giving us the gift of faith. God effectively saves his people by giving them new hearts and the gift of faith, that we in turn exercise in our renewed will. So how does this help avoid both errors, both extremes in approaching the warnings in the Bible? The warnings are actually immensely relevant. They are God's means that he uses to keep his people on his path. They are God's means to spur on Christians in their faith. Because God is at work in and through us, his warnings ought to lead us to three things: a healthy fear of God, a sincere self-examination, and a confident trust that God will finish the work that he began in us. A healthy fear of the Lord is not one that results in extreme anxiety or scrupulosity. It is rather a posture of humility before God. Because God is our almighty creator, we ought to submit ourselves to him. Proverbs calls this the beginning of wisdom. And as we fear God by placing ourselves at his feet, we can honestly look at our lives with a clear vision. We can confess and turn from those things which don't align with his will. And warnings help us to do just that. They give us the opportunity and the motivation to examine ourselves. And a Christian will always be someone who is sensitive to God's commands. It's the moment that you no longer are concerned about God's warnings that you actually ought to be afraid. That's callousness. Being a Christian, however, doesn't mean that we follow God's commands perfectly. It means that we strive to because we love Him. He died for us to secure our salvation from sin and death and we in turn love Him by confessing our sins and turning from them and seeking amendment of life. Do you see how this differs from both extremes? Warnings ought to cause us to humble ourselves and examine our hearts, but we do so not in a slavish fear with overwhelming anxiety. We do so as renewed children who can trust God to bring about the work that He's begun in us. My friends, I hope this encourages you today to heed the warnings that we've heard over the last 2 Sundays, and that together we can mutually encourage one another through our exhortation. Let me close with 2 verses from the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 3:13 says this, "But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." And Hebrews 10:24 says, "Let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Well, God bless you all, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.